All right, welcome. Thank you all so much for coming to this very unique book talk today. I'm Teresa Miguel Stearns, Associate Dean and Director of the fabulous Daniel F. Cracchiolo Law Library, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this faculty book talk with our featured author, Professor Tessa Dysart, in conversation with Professor Shalev Roisman to discuss Professor Dysart's most recent book, the Supreme Court Counting Book. Professor Dysart is the Assistant Director of Legal Writing and Clinical Professor here at the University of Arizona James E. Rogers College of Law. She also serves as the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Appellate Practice and Process, which we acquired back in 2020. Professor Dysart is a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation, and since 2023, she has served as a Judge Pro Tem for the Tohono O'odham Nation. After graduating from Harvard Law School, Professor Dysart clerked for the Honorable Dennis W. Shedd of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, and her practice experience includes working for the United States Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel and the Senate Judiciary Committee. Professor Dysart writes and speaks nationally on appellate advocacy issues. She is the author or editor of 4 books now, including the 3rd edition of Winning on Appeal, A Short and Happy Guide to Judicial Clerkships, and Law Teaching Strategies for a New Era. Her publications have appeared in the Green Bag, the Columbia Human Rights Law Review, the Duke Journal of Gender Law and Policy, and the Cornell Journal of Law and Public Policy. Shalev Roisman teaches courses in administrative law, constitutional law, and presidential power. He joined the University of Arizona from Harvard Law School, his alma mater, where he was a Klemenko Fellow and lecturer in law. Prior to that, he served as an attorney advisor in the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel, an assistant professor of lawyering at New York University Law School, a senior associate in the litigation department of William Hale Law Firm, and as law clerk to Judge Gerard E. Lynch and Judge Robert D. Sack on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Now, in addition to these impressive legal credentials, Professors Dysart and Roisman have what truly qualifies them to participate in this unique book talk, which is having young children. Tessa's children, James, who's 6.5, and Vera, who's 4 years old, are here today with their father and their grandparents. Welcome. And Shalev's children, Noah and Esty, are 8 and 5 years old, respectively. Please join me in congratulating Professor Dysart on her most recent book and welcoming her and Professor Roisman to this very unique and special book talk.
Start with a reading of the book. It's probably the only faculty book talk where we have enough time to read the entire book. And then we'll go from there. All right, so the dedication. I'll start with the dedication and then there we go. Dedication to Vera, who can now count to 10. One, Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the United States is the highest federal court in the country. It is located at 1 First Street Northeast in Washington, D.C. Before the Supreme Court's current building was finished in 1935, the court met in several locations, including in the United States Capitol building. You. All right, two sides arguing before the court. The court hears arguments for cases involving 2 different sides, also called parties. The petitioner, the side that lost the case in the lower court, and the respondent, the side that won the case below. Parties before the court can be an individual, a group of people, an organization, or even a state or a country. 3 judge panels below. The Supreme Court hears cases that were heard first in the federal courts of appeal, which decide cases using panels of 3 judges. Parties bring their cases first in the federal trial court. If they lose a trial, they can appeal or bring their case to the federal courts of appeal. If they lose there, they can ask the Supreme Court to hear the case. There are 12 different federal courts of appeals based on geography, and 1, the Federal Circuit, based on the type of case being heard. What circuit do you live in?
We're in the Ninth Circuit.
Or You're new this. 4, votes to grant a writ of certiorari, which is how I say it. Before the Supreme Court can decide to take a case, it needs to grant a writ of certiorari. A writ of certiorari is an order from the Supreme Court to the lower court to send the case record to the Supreme Court for further review. The petitioner asks the court to grant a writ of certiorari, and the justices vote on the request. It takes 4 votes to grant a writ of certiorari. 5 justices to decide a case. It takes the vote of 5 justices to declare one side the winner. Typically, one justice will write something called an opinion, which explains the court's decision. The justices who disagree with the decision also write an explanation called a dissent. Often, all the justices agree on how to decide a case. 6, original justices on the Supreme Court. The number of justices on the Supreme Court has changed 6 times since the first Judiciary Act of 1789, which set the number of justices at 6. John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court justices are appointed by the President of the United States and voted on, also known as confirmed, by the United States Senate. Supreme Court justices serve for life or until they resign. 7, amicus briefs. Amicus is a Latin word meaning friend of the court. People, states, or even organizations that are interested in a case but not directly involved can file an amicus brief to the court, telling the court how they think it should decide the case. 8, famous lawgivers. The current Supreme Court building was finished in 1935. The classical architecture includes many symbolic statues or images that represent the ideas of justice or portray important lawgivers in history. The outside of the building contains 8 images called medallions, representing famous lawgivers, philosophers, and advocates. 9 current justices. Although the original Supreme Court had only 6 justices, since 1869, there have been 9 justices on the court. In 1937, President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced a plan to increase the number of justices to as many as 15, but that plan never passed Congress. And 10 letters in the word certiorari. For the Supreme Court to hear a case, it must first grant a petition for a writ of certiorari. Certiorari is a Latin word that means to be more fully informed. Once the court grants a writ of certiorari, the parties then submit formal briefs to the court and argue the case. And then there's a glossary and a brief history, but I won't read it. So there we go. And like a true mother, I forgot how to read it.
Well, thank you. And I will say that I brought it home and read it to my kids, and they must have enjoyed it so much that they put it somewhere where I couldn't find it. Success, I think. So I learned a lot from this book. For example, I learned about Tortoise, the lawgiver, who I didn't know who that was. I still don't know who that is, but now I know that they're on the Supreme Court briefs, which is very interesting. So obviously one of these books is not like the other. And I was wondering if you could just start by telling us a little bit about kind of the origin story, how you came to writing a book of this sort rather than a more standard book for you.
So when James was born, I got this idea that I should write a children's book about kind of the work that I did, not being a law professor because nobody wants to read that book, but on appellate work in general, because I found that there weren't a lot of children's books about law that were written by lawyers, right? So there's like all these ABC books and even ABC books about lawyers, but not written by lawyers. So I started looking into it, and there's a lot of thought that goes into an ABC book. Like, does it rhyme? Does it not rhyme? And who's your illustrator? And I have in my box folder, I have like 4 or 5 different versions of this ABC book, and it just wasn't happening. It wasn't happening. Well, then Vera was born, and really struggled with counting to 5. But we were pretty sure there was many things she was never going to be able to do in her life, and one of them was to ever count to 5. And And so I started thinking, I was like, I could do a counting book first. That's only 10 versus 26. It's much more manageable in size. And as I started thinking about the Supreme Court, I'm like, yeah, the Supreme Court counting book almost writes itself with so many key aspects of how the court operates. So that's how I pivoted to the counting book. Interestingly, the length of time in all of these books, the longest to publication is this one.
Well, so that I think is a nice segue into another question I have, which is just a little bit about kind of how do you publish a book like this? How's it different than publishing a more academic book?
Yeah, look, all my books have an interesting story of how they came about, but there's a pretty active community, so to speak, of self-publishers of children's books. So I think the traditional way to publish a children's book is you hire an agent and they market your book to traditional publishers. You don't need an illustrator, right? You just come with a text and they work you through the system, and it's about a 2-year system. And I tried to sort of throw my idea out, and I didn't have an agent. Maybe I should have, but I was trying to do this on a budget and, you know, in my free time, which obviously I have a lot of. So I never found an agent, and I sent the manuscript of the ABC book to a few people, and no one ever picked up on it. And so I'm like, I'm a smart, intelligent woman. I can self-publish a book. So I decided to go the self-publication route. And I talked to a few people. I just randomly would connect with people who had self-published children's books. And I did a couple calls and kind of the process and how to get it done. I found an illustrator. That was a long process. And actually, right as I was almost done with the illustration of the text, I saw on a Facebook page of published children's books authors this publishing company that was looking for authors. And I thought, I'm just gonna reach out to them and see. And the good fortune, so I reached out to Solander Press. Their owner is a retired professor of early childhood education who's written much of the curriculum used in preschools across the country. And so she loved this idea, you know, of a book and was pretty reasonable to work with. There's in the self-publishing world, there's vanity presses where you can pay tens of thousands of dollars for them to publish your book. That was not her. Basically I paid her to upload it, onto Amazon and do some basic editing. So my book was kind of a hybrid book in that it's not exactly self-published, it's published through a press, but I think a lot of the process followed self-publishing. I found my own illustrator, I did a lot of my own edits, and they just kind of do my own marketing, which is why it's not yet a bestseller. Although I was like number 1 or 2 in top children's releases, law and crime books, because the category on. But anyway, that's sort of how I stumbled into finding a publisher, and I've been really happy working with them.
Great. And so you mentioned working with an illustrator. Obviously, I assume you didn't use illustrators for your other book. What was it kind of like working with an illustrator, going back and forth? Or?
Yeah, so my illustrator is a non-lawyer, shockingly, and so I had some strong visions of things I wanted. Like I was very, very set that the first picture would be this picture of my kids with the back of them looking at the Supreme Court. Like this was totally in my head, and he was really good about doing that. But you first have to kind of decide on a style. So there's all these different. Think about those of you parents, all the different styles of children's books. So I looked through a bunch of samples, and then I sent him like, here's some styles of illustration, that I keep gravitating to. And so he had that. And then when I sent him the text of the book, I sent some illustration notes of like, hey, this is kind of what I'm thinking. And there was times where he changed things, and I was like, oh, that was for the better. And there was time to redo things, and I'd come back and we'd go back and forth. But then actually when you get to publication, then you have to think of your images, especially if they cover a whole spread, that there's going to be a crease in the middle of the page. And so how is that going to line up? So when we finally got connected with a publishing company, there were different things that had to happen to the illustrations to make them fit within. So I really did things not in the right order. And I think if you start with knowing your parameters a little bit better, that can make the whole thing much smoother and maybe not take 2 to 2.5 years.
And who is the kind of target audience for this book?
Yeah, so I joke with the audience, because people have asked me this, and even on Amazon, when you upload it, they're like, what's the audience for your book? 0 to 99, So I would think if I'm reading it to just Vera or someone her age or younger, I might just read the, one Supreme Court of the United States, and then I'll move on to two, and I won't read the explanation. But James is actually, because he's such a star reader, has read the whole book and has much more of a capacity to understand it. But then the funny thing is my sister-in-law is a teacher, and she teaches 5th grade and teaches a government class. And so she helped, review the book as a non-lawyer. But she also said, look, this is something I would use in my 5th grade class. And it has a lot of, really interesting information. So I think really the audience is anyone. I mean, I always kind of thought that these could also be like a gag gift for a law student. Here's a book for you to learn about before you take on law. Yeah, so a wide audience.
Okay, and I imagine in kind of writing a book like this, it's hard to balance kind of like accuracy and nuance, which are very like lawyerly skills, with accessibility for 3 to 99-year-olds. And so how did you manage to do that? Were there parts of the book that you found more challenging than others in that respect? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of getting a lot of people to read the book, but it's funny. I mean, Andrew and I are both lawyers. Most of our friends with kids are lawyers. Most of our professional and personal colleagues are lawyers. And so it's like, who can I ask to read this book? So I had my sister-in-law read it, my nieces actually, who are college age, and one of them wants to get into kind of publication and stuff. She read it. I think I probably had my parents read it. And so it's just getting a number of people to read it. And then actually the publishers had some really nice feedback. But I will tell you all, since we're mostly lawyers in this room, my biggest thing I agonized over in terms of accuracy versus understanding. And where is that here? No, it's there. So it's on, yes, here we go. The 6 original justices. So I say they're voted on or confirmed. And then I say they serve for life until they resign. I didn't say anything about impeachment. It's like, oh, do I say it? Do I not say it? And it's just like, first of all, there's a lot of text on this page, and you've got to balance picture and text and not have too much text. So that was the one thing I still think about, like, was that the right decision or not? And it's done. Maybe in the 2nd edition.
Oh, that's a great example. Let me see if I had any other process questions. Okay, so I think I've covered those, and so then I want to ask you some really, hard-hitting substantive questions about this. Well, one of the things I learned about the book actually is the image of the tortoise, which is not something I had ever associated with the Supreme Court. And so I was wondering, so that's obviously plays a role kind of throughout the book, as people saw as you read it. How did you come up with that? What is the role what do you see as its kind of place, and what does it represent about the Supreme Court?
So I love children's books where the kids have to find something on every page. It's like, you find a little mouse, some of them are really hard. And so I wanted that to, again, be engaging for the younger audiences who have really long attention spans. And we started with a kitty, because we have kitties at our house, and the perspective wasn't very good. And then I think I asked James, and he's like, a butterfly, so we did all these different animals, and we couldn't really find something that worked. So I was reading a book to review for the journal on this woman's case that she argued before the U.S. Supreme Court. And as I was reading her book, I learned that the tortoise is the symbol of the Supreme Court, which I had never heard before. And it represents the slow and steady pace of justice. And so I thought, that's what we should do. We should do a tortoise. It's not just finding some random animal, it's actually finding an animal that relates to the court. But the funny thing is page 8, I don't know if Teresa can scroll down there. So I think Andrew was reading a near final version of the book, and he's like, you don't have a tortoise on this page. Did you do that on purpose? And I said, no, I did not do that on purpose. So we had to slide in a tortoise on number 8, which is the 8 lawgivers. He's able to like slide one in. But that's how we ended up on the tortoise. So
okay, great. And then and you can also see Pothier or whatever.
Yeah.
Much topic, I'm sure, for the students in the room. Okay, and then in terms of 7, maybe we could show that too. It was amicus briefs. And I was just wondering, was this like an example where there wasn't a natural place to put it, and there wasn't a natural 7, or like how did you come up with amicus briefs for 7? And also, I thought it might be a good example to talk about kind of your work with the illustrator of how to choose who to depict as the relevant groups holding the amicus briefs?
Yeah, so there was a couple of numbers where there wasn't something natural that came up. And so then there were concepts that I wanted to incorporate in the book, like the concept of amicus briefs, in part because that's something that I worked on earlier in my career. So this was a page where my illustrator did a lot more development than I had originally planned. So I had planned this as more a mix of images of different types of groups that could be amici before the court, like a state symbol or, an organization symbol or something like that. And he came up with this idea. And then when he showed it to me, I was like, oh, that's a really cool idea. Because I think I had to explain to him what amicus briefs are and the types of people who could file amicus briefs. So then I wanted to have a lot of diversity in the book and wanted everyone to feel represented. And so he did a good job of doing that, and then working in professors and construction workers and sports people and doctors and just different types of people who could file amicus briefs before the court. And then originally had him just holding white sheets of paper, and I said, well, the color cover, for those of you who are familiar with your Supreme Court brief colors, for amicus briefs are green, because actually one of the numbers I wanted to do was the number of colors used in brief covers, and I thought that was going to be 8, but I think it's really 9. I think I had to count it like a good mom. I was probably really tired each time I counted it and never came up with the same number. And so then when I realized it was 9, I'm like, well, no, I'm set with 9 members on the court. So this was a way to kind of fit it in.
Great. And on 9, you mentioned in the text that there's 9 current justices. I think we all know. And then you also mentioned the court packing plan that FDR tried to put in place. How did you choose to kind of include that versus other things? Or
that's a great question. I was probably really tired and reading something about Franklin Roosevelt, and I might have been writing this around the time there were other talks about expanding the court, but if I was more thoughtful, I would say I like that it demonstrates how both Congress and the president are involved in, deciding how the court structure works. But my guess is that I was working on this one around the time of the more recent court packing schemes that have been going around.
Right, and then just kind of as takeaways, and then I'll open it up because I know some of us have short attention spans in the room. And so I was wondering, kind of, how do you think about, now that you've done it, writing this book, and what are your thoughts about kind of the process about writing for children rather than writing for lawyers, for judges, for law professors? Are there things you would take away from your child, writing for children that you might apply when you're trying to write for more professional audiences? Or
so when I think about why we write, we like to expand knowledge in an area, but we often write for ourselves. Maybe occasionally for law students. Like this book, Winning on Appeal, is very much a practitioner and a student guide. It's used by professors to teach, but it has a pretty limited but dedicated audience. This book, so my kids, I always thought it'd be cool. Especially James is such a good reader. I'll show him my books. I'm like, whose name is on there? Like, Mommy? And I'm like, what do you think about that? And he looks at it and he's like, oh, whatever. This book, when it came in, he was probably 3 when this book was done. And I remember we got the copy, and I was so excited. I gave it to him, and he looked at it and he dropped it on the ground. I was like, wow, that was a great review. Like this book has got a smiley face on it. I mean, who doesn't like a book with a smiley face? But in reality, most of my non-lawyer friends don't really care that I've published books in areas, because none of these speak to what they do. This is a book that's so accessible, and I think explains, well, I like to think it's accessible, but explains, some of my work and areas that I've focused on in my career to anybody. And it makes me a cooler mom, in the pickup line of, oh, you've written a book on the Supreme Court, and there's a gift that I can give out to other moms. And so I like thinking that it's a way to kind of reach a broader audience, apart from just our typical academic writing audience. Although I will say it's probably just as much work as writing a law review article. It's not any less work in the end.
And then I know, when we were speaking before, you mentioned that you have some future children's books plans. What are some other kind of future works in this stream?
Yes, so I need to update Winning on Appeal, which is probably my next big book project. That was my no longer existing sabbatical for the spring. But what I would like to do, I'd still like to do the ABC book. And I think now that I've done this, I have a better idea of how I would create it. I won't make it rhyme because I think unless you are a natural poet, which I am not, making things rhyme just ends up being really cheesy and stupid. So, oops, and silly, really cheesy and silly. And so I will not try to make it rhyme. But I'd also like to do 1 or 2 books on constitutional law for children or law students, where I don't know if you're familiar with, Lynn Cheney has a book, A is for Abigail, and it covers like important women in US history with each letter of the alphabet. And so I'd like to do that with Supreme Court cases and kind of highlight a few different cases per letter of the alphabet. Those are some of my ideas down the road.
That's great. And my last question is, where can people purchase this book?
Oh, yes. So you can purchase it on Amazon and leave a 5-star review. The more reviews, the more Amazon pushes out the book. It's available in hardcover and softcover. And you can buy both of those on Amazon, and I will sign it for you. The lawyer that I am, I have still not figured out how to legally sell the book and collect taxes and not get in trouble. So I just haven't had enough free time. But I think if I buy like a square, Andrew's my accountant, so we've got to have time to figure out how we can legally sell the book, and then I might try to do some like book fairs or something like that in the future.
Great. And so then I thought we could open it up for questions from anyone in the audience.
Oh my gosh.
Andrew, I saw your hand first.
I think this is so awesome. So first, just congrats. I think it's a great book, and we're gonna go buy one. I thought you were gonna have them on sale, but you're too much.
The lawyer in me.
Yeah. I have a question. Teresa, can you put page 5 up?
Oh, sure.
One of the things that strikes me about this, I think my daughter only hears about the court in a very ideological context, really in a pejorative way. And one of the things that's so striking about this book is, like, in 2024, you've written a book about the court that is not ideological. That's a real accomplishment, to celebrate the court and not get in the 5-4, or 6-3 nonsense. But this page did have me immediately wonder, have you listed them by ideological?
No. So this is one of the pages in my mind, which was way too complex. Like, I'm glad the illustrator sort of talked me off of what I wanted to do. So I wanted to have, that's such a lawyer. I wanted to have like a 9 justice on one side, and then a 0, and then a 5-4, and then a 4, 1-4, and show like all the different iterations of how the court could come down, and then say like unanimous, majority, plurality. And that's too complicated. That is too complicated, right? So he just did this. I mean, I didn't show him pictures of the Supreme Court justices and what they look like. I said, look, I want it to be diverse representation. And so he did his own research and kind of came up with this. But yeah, I mean, there's clearly justices who look like their counterpart.
I guess someone gets to hold the tortoise.
Yeah.
Like Merrick Garland.
Okay, so I did buy the book, and I did it legally, as far as I know. And Tessa was kind enough to autograph it, and I gave it to my grandbaby, who's 4 months old. He got through it very quickly.
Yeah.
But this is a comment. So my daughter-in-law, who actually is very bright, did Teach for America, taught 3rd grade for many years, was trying to read it to him and was stumbling over certiorari.
Yes.
And her comment was, how are mothers supposed to read, non-lawyers read this book? So I think in your 2nd edition, maybe do a pronunciation of it. That's the other thing I told her, which I don't know if it's true. Maybe I made it up. Did you say this is in the Supreme Court Library?
Yeah. So two great points. On the certiorari point, I didn't think about that. I mean, I know there's, debate over how to pronounce certiorari. I think I've had friends who have written articles about, how you pronounce it. I mean, it didn't even cross my mind. It was not the like up late at night of whether I mentioned if, justices can be impeached. But then Advisory Opinions, the podcast, I don't know if you all listened to that, but they did a review of it. And Sarah Isker, that was her one comment, is that certiorari is in there too many times and nobody knows how to say it. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. I mean, I did struggle with how to explain the concept of certiorari because it's an important concept and it's kind of complicated and it doesn't have a great Latin understanding like amicus, you know? But no, I did not think about that. I will consider adding a phonetic pronunciation guide in the future in version 2. And yes, on the Supreme Court Library. So, so again, like I said, I'm my own marketer, which basically involved Facebook and LinkedIn. And I think if you followed me on either of those for the first 3 months of the book being out, that's all you saw were like nonstop posts about how you could get the book and, you know, raise my rankings. But I knew that the Supreme Court Historical Society followed me on Twitter, probably because of the journal. And so I, as the true professional I am, I sent them a Twitter message and said, hey, did you see that I just published a children's book on the Supreme Court? And they said, yes, we've already bought it. All right. So they bought a copy and then they said they would carry it. I had not like received a picture. So if any of you are going to be in DC at the Supreme Court Historical Society bookstore, like please pop in. And if you send me a picture, I'll give you a free copy of the book. But yes, they said it's not on their online store, but I believe they were going to carry it, which would be about as awesome as being published in the green bag. So
I think Susie, did you have that?
My question was just about that you just answered.
Just a comment. I believe the Yale Law Library is the only library with a collection, a children's law book collection, an international collection, and I can attest that they also have a copy of your book. So if anyone ever needs to do research, deep research into children's law books, it will be there.
and I think the U of A bookstore was going to carry it. And so part of actually using a publisher is that you can upload your book to a program called Ingram Spark, which is one of the places that prints the hardcover. So all of my hardcover books are printed by Ingram Spark. And if you want to carry your book in like a Barnes and Noble or more of a traditional bookstore, you have to be on Ingram Spark. And so that's how that all worked out too. So I think I have not seen it in the bookstore, but I heard that they were going to buy it. I dropped a copy off with them and they were going to buy it as well.
I really loved your book. I got it for my son who's 10. He did skim through it, but he is interested more like I think in criminal trials. Like he's interested in like the police, they can arrest you, but then he just jumps to and then you're in jail for trying to explain no, there's a tort process. I was wondering if you would think about doing like a book about like the trial process for kids so they can understand. Like he knows the word prosecutor from spelling bee, but doesn't really understand everything.
Well, so this is I think part of the impetus of writing this book because I have not had a criminal law background at all. My husband was a prosecutor for a long time, and it was super cool before we had kids and we would visit my nieces and nephews. And it was like Uncle Andrew put a kid in jail over Christmas, and they'd be like, "Oh, like, we're not going to do that because Uncle Andrew's put a kid in jail." And even James, you know, when I do pro temp work and I'm like, yeah, mommy left somebody in jail. They do. I said, well, they didn't listen to the police and they probably didn't listen to their mommies, you know, either. I'm pretty sure. But I think for that, I think it's a great area, but it needs to have someone who knows that area. And that's why the appellate work was perfect for me. So much more boring. And so to make appellate work exciting for kids is definitely, it's all about, you know, vibrant illustrations and good copy.
And the other thing I wanted to say was I love the turtle, and I agree. Like the kids love finding those animals or finding the special picture. But I was wondering, like the lawyer in me, the former lawyer in me, wanted to tell my son, like, wait a second, it's not always slow and steady. Actually, there could be dramatic changes. So how would you explain that to like an older kid, like the nuance of it, maybe, or?
So I think there's definitely opportunities in using the glossary and the history of the court. And then, you know, once they have a basic understanding, maybe listening to the news and understanding, especially in June when all the big cases are coming out. And there's ways to talk about it. I mean, the goal of it being slow and steady, but you're right, it's not always slow and steady. And sometimes the court, even taking a slow and steady approach, gets it wrong. And that's, you know, something important to think about too, is that just like people, justices are make mistakes. Like they are people. Questions for anybody? Okay. Vera, do you have any questions? No. Like, does my car drive on lava? Ask Daddy. That's the thing. You already know. We talk about that a lot. So. Yeah, I think unless anybody else has any questions, thanks for coming.
All right.